Okay, so based off all that information, you can generate, if you so choose, all these curves. Now, all this comes off of his documentation, okay? So, but you can do it for whatever folios and strategies you're working on. He gives you an idea of here's the trend time constant versus the score, okay? And obviously in this case, you know, he's going to pick something down here, looks like it's in the neighborhood of 11 days or something like that, because that's the peak score for that. And so he'll say, oh, the time constant should match up with that peak right there. Over the years, what you'll see is in this particular case, the trend time constant started off high for whatever reason, and then it kind of settled out to be around 19 days per this graph. Average return, okay, you can't quite see it because it got chopped off here down at the bottom, but this is the graph that answers the question, if I don't trade at the exact end of the month, how much money do I make or lose, okay? And so this is 0, so that's if you trade at the end of every month, okay? And you'll notice that's pretty high on the curve, okay? I.e. you're making a lot of money if you trade at the end of the exact end of the month. And now if you go plus or minus 5 days, you can see what happens to the gain, okay? So it wiggles around, okay? And for those of you who are fans of the stock Trader's Almanac, if I remember correctly. Yeah. And this gets into seasonality and how many days before the end of the month or before a holiday should you trade and buy, and how many you should you sell afterwards, and so on. He's finding the same sort of effect, okay? And you can see whether this matters for your folio or for your strategy. You can just go in there and say, he happened, the number we were looking at was a -4. You know, you can set it to +5. You can generate this curve if you want to, okay? And then same thing here, only now he's plotting not only the score, the performance score, he also plotted the safety number, okay? And so you can do all this for any of your strategies if you're so inclined. I think this is, to be blunt, I think this is probably for the, 10% of the people that are really getting into it, okay? Most people won't visit these screens and do all this plots and so on. Now, since I'm in the 10%, guess what? I plotted this stuff, right? All right, next slide, please. Okay, so that's how it's all supposed to work, okay? And he showed us a nice little example where you turn on walk forward testing, and yeah, your performance goes down a little bit, but not all that much. Well, what I did is I went through and I had a number of different strategies, real world strategies, i.e. money strategies and folios that I have money invested in, okay? In, for example, my 401k or equivalent. And so I looked at REIT ETFs. For those of you who are familiar with Mabane Favor, he has he's got an asset allocation that uses 10 different ETFs in different asset classes. Okay, so I looked at that, and I looked at the 10 S&P sector ETFs, okay, pure U.S. stock sectors, okay, and I looked at a bunch of variations of these. Okay, I looked at what happens with the standard timer, what happens if you turn on AQR, what happens when you turn on walk forward testing with and without strong filtering, looking at long-term trends versus short-term trends, etc. Now, you can go nuts doing this, okay? I mean, there are lots and lots of variations here, and I'm only looking at a few, strategies, okay? So this is what would be called, would be put in the category of anecdotal evidence, okay? I.e., this isn't, truth delivered from God. It's not a statistical proof or whatever. It's just what happened in these particular cases. So what I'm going to do is go through and show you some slide captures or screen captures from when I did all this testing. And I'll point out some of the highlights on all this. But at the end, there's a slide that essentially has a chart that compares everything, okay? And so try and grasp the concepts as we walk through, and then what will happen is you can compare the chart at the end. All right, next slide. All right, so this is where I'm running REITs, okay? And I've got 12 REITs, US and international, mortgage REITs, infrastructure REITs, etc. Okay? And this is what I'll call standard SectorSurfer, i.e. the way we always run it, right? No knobs turn on, okay? Someone keep track of these because I'm going to forget them, okay? The score is 77, and the 13-year gain is 18.5%, okay? So that's what SectorSurfer says. You do that, and boom, this is what will come out. Next slide. Okay, so now I turn on walk-forward testing, with a short-term bias in terms of the trend. And by the way, you can see all these options right up here. He tells you what's on. Okay, walk-forward testing, storm guard, standard storm guard with short-term trends. Okay, and you can tell you're in walk-forward mode because this started back on June 23rd of 2005. So that's the beginning date. See these little yellow hatch marks? That tells you that's where he retuned his algorithm, okay? So that's how he does walk-forward testing, and that's June of 2005, roughly 8.5 years ago. All right, so first off, I think we were around 18%?
Yeah, 18.5.
We're now at 13.7, okay, for all time. And the score went down to 46.2, okay? So a not insignificant hit, okay, in terms of what you can expect. This is a lot more realistic, okay, because this is the sort of thing you and I would do, okay. All right. I also looked at long-term trends, and I looked at filtering, okay, running the algorithm a second time, and it made the performance go down even more, okay. So one of the things you can do for your algorithm, I mentioned this now so that you can think about this as we go through. There's about 3 or 4 knobs that you can turn and find out, does it help your algorithm or does it hurt your algorithm in terms of performance, okay? Next one.
So Al?
Yes, sir.
On that one, the initial tuning years isn't that many.
That is correct.
And so if you look out toward the right-hand thing where I assume he's gonna use all the data when he tuned in 2012, all the prior data.
Yep.
And so now he's converging on the original one, which used all the data, when he tuned it.
That is correct.
So you would expect to see better and better as you get to the end. And there's not that many years in this one, so
No, it's the fact that some of these ETFs have short histories do not help, and you are correct. What should happen, and I think I've more or less verified this, that at the very end here, with this last parameter tuning, in this case, roughly 6 months ago, maybe 4 months ago, the parameters he comes up with here should look a lot like the parameters if you just ran it normally, okay? Now, again, depending what knobs you turn on, that may or may not be true. In other words, if you allow long-term trends to exist or be looked for, that's not part of the standard tool, okay? So that's another way you can kind of use this as well, okay? But you're right, one of the things that kind of distort all this is, well, what about the amount of time, the history all these have? I've got plenty of examples just to answer that question. Next slide. Okay.
Are these long trades only?
These are long trades only. Other than if you put an inverse fund into SectorSurfer, he really doesn't do shorts. All right, so now what happens, again, I'm doing walk forward testing. What happens if I turn the new timer on, AQR, okay? Well, it helps. You're back up to 24% over time, okay? So this likes faster, getting in and out faster, okay? And your score went back up to 86. So one knob he gives you to twiddle, suddenly, boom, that was a big deal for this algorithm. Next slide. Okay. Same thing. I've got AQR turning on now. Now I'm doing walk forward. It bumps up the number. I think the original walk forward testing was around under 14%. Now you're above 16%. Okay? So it helps the walk forward part of the algorithm as well. Okay? So it's very consistent. Okay? And again, your score went up. It was horrible before. It's still pretty low. Next slide. All right. What happens if I look for long-term trends now? So I'm using the enhanced timer, and I'm looking for long-term trends, and now I'm up to 20%. Okay. So with doing walk-forward testing. So basically, you can kind of tune his algorithm to some degree between the timer you choose and the few knobs he gives you. You can tune things to make to enhance the algorithm for your set of funds. And every set of funds, and you'll see this in a few minutes, it's going to be different. Okay, so different funds like different things. Next slide. All right. So remember that Excel sheet I showed you? Okay, this is an example of a graph where effectively you've got the score over here versus the number of days. Okay, and you can kind of see it's really noisy, but you know there's an uptrend here. This particular set of funds tends to like longer term. Okay, that's why when I turn on the long-term switch, it did that. Okay. Next slide. What happened with the time constant? And that is a mistake right there. I don't know how to spell. You know, it started off relatively high and it ended up being somewhere around 11 days. Okay? So you can take a look, and this is all in that Excel spreadsheet because this just plots all that data. You can see what the algorithm is doing over time. And you can, to some degree, maybe help it a lot, okay, in terms of the knobs you twist. Next slide. Okay, so now for the favored 10 assets. Next slide. All right, so in this particular case, you go back to 2001. Most of the funds exist, so there's less of the problem that you were mentioning, Mike. Again, the numbers here are 15% and a score of 48. Okay. Next slide. Okay, turn on walk forward testing. Interestingly enough, the 13-year gain went up to 16%. Okay, so retuning actually helped in this case. Okay, didn't help in the last 3 years though. The last 3 years actually went down. Before it was around 10%, now it's down to around 3%. And I can tell you, because I invest in this sort of thing, yeah, that's a lot more realistic than 10%. No way you made 10% off the favorite 10 in the last 3 years. You just didn't. Those multi-asset algorithms are really suffering right now. And the score, 42. And turning on long-term trends, looking for long-term trends, didn't help this a bit. Okay? Didn't hurt it, but it didn't help it. Okay? Next slide. Stronger filtering. That's when he does a pass of his algorithm one time, sets the parameters, and then you can make him do a second pass and retune without moving forward in time, just running the algorithm again.